Have you ever finished an interview and thought there was something there, but I didn't quite get to it? Or maybe your guest said something that felt important, that carried weight, but before you realized it, the moment had passed. You moved on and you wish you hadn't. Why is it that some podcast hosts consistently spark these powerful, unforgettable moments while others stay on the surface, even with incredible guests? It isn't because they ask better questions. It's because they listen for the story beneath the story, which almost never comes from the questions you ask, but from how you listen and what you hear. The truth is, the story your guest is meant to tell is almost always the one they did not plan to share. Your job as a host isn't to extract information. Your interview is not an investigation. It's an invitation to create a moment where truth feels safe enough to rise. I've seen this in clinic. A patient comes in for a routine follow-up, labs are fine, the visit should be quick, but after one question, I pause, creating space, inviting dialogue, and they say, "Actually, do you have a minute? Can I tell you something?" And I've seen this behind the mic. A guest answers your questions perfectly, polished, professional, but you hear them hesitate on one word. And after reflecting that word back to them, they say, "I don't usually talk about this, but..." The same skills that help a patient finally admit they're scared are the exact skills that help a guest go deeper than simply reciting their resume. And that's what creates interviews people remember. It's what turns a first-time listener into a subscriber, a guest into your biggest podcast advocate, and a podcast into something people want to be a part of. But none of that comes from better questions. It comes from better listening. Real listening takes skills we already use in healthcare and blends them into the way we interview our podcast guests. Holding space for silence, examining the signals your guest is giving you, asking for more, and reflecting back what was said. This is the HEAR framework, a way of listening to hear that helps you uncover the story beneath the story. But before I break it down, we have to address two big mistakes almost every host and every new healthcare provider make when speaking with patients or guests. First, we focus too much on our own questions. Most of us come in prepared, sometimes over-prepared. We cling to our outline, we hit each point, we check each box, but preparation can create tunnel vision. And when we're locked into what we want to ask next, we miss what the guest is offering right now. Second, we are listening for information instead of meaning. You can hear every word your guest says and still miss the message, what they want to say. That's where the deeper story lives, and that's the story your listeners will remember. So how do you get there? You stop interviewing like a host and you start listening like a human. That's where the HEAR framework comes in. Listening to hear is 4 simple steps that help you listen intentionally and open unexpected doors in your conversation. HEAR is an acronym. Hold the space, examine the signals, ask for more, reflect it back. Let me show you how hearing changes a conversation and the surprising way it may change you and your guest too. Holding space means resisting the urge to push forward in a conversation. In practice, it's simple. When your guest finishes speaking, pause for 2 beats. 1, 2. Most guests fill that silence, and what they say next is almost always richer, more honest, and more revealing. During this pause, soften your body language. A few nods, or stillness in your posture, or a slight lean into the camera are all tiny signals that say you're not being rushed. You can keep going. Next in the HEAR framework is E, examining the signals. Now, this may come naturally to you if you play poker or are an expert in human behavior. But even if you're not, once you start finding these signals during your interview, they're impossible to miss. And they are one of the greatest gems to discover when you're looking for a way to go deeper in your interview. Signals are the tiny clues your guest gives you, often without realizing it. It can be a phrase, an offhand statement like, "It wasn't a big deal. I haven't talked about this much. That was a weird season." It can be a physical change that you notice. A heavy sigh, a glance away, a quick swallow, a tightened jaw. But perhaps the most difficult and impactful signal to recognize is when your guest minimizes an emotional truth, when the meaning and emotion of what they're saying doesn't match the situation they're describing. The two most common ways this presents in interviews is as narrative minimization and emotional deflection. Narrative minimization sounds like this: "It wasn't a big deal, but," or "I have no room to complain." A guest may say, "That year almost broke me," and then immediately laugh. They could share a major loss and follow it with, "Anyway." Perhaps they mention a challenging situation, and then they pivot too fast to discussing productivity or success. And then you have emotional deflection, which is a variety of different flavors, turning pain into humor. So yeah, trauma, classic med school experience, right? Turning grief into achievement. But through it all, it made me stronger. Turning doubt into credentials. And so that's when I decided to get another degree. When a guest minimizes an emotional truth like this, it's often a sign of uncertainty. They don't know if you are a safe place to discuss what they're about to share. Or they may feel a need to shrink an experience that clearly mattered, downplaying its impact and moving past it quickly to avoid taking up too much room. What you're really hearing is not indifference, it's caution. So when you learn to catch these signals, you start hearing what's underneath their words, not just the words themselves, the story beneath the story. And your interview will shift from an investigation to an invitation, allowing you to dive into the next step in the HEAR framework. A, asking for more. Asking for more is simple in theory, but more difficult in practice. It's where one gentle question blows open the bigger story. It's saying, "Tell me more about that. What made that moment stand out? What happened next?" Because you have set the stage with the HEAR framework, these short questions will lead to long, deeply meaningful answers. Now, asking your guest for more opens the door, but it doesn't hold it open. To invite the full story with all its layers and meaning, you also have to reflect back what you're hearing to them. Reflection is the final step of the HEAR framework, and it's the moment your guest feels seen. It completes the invitation and allows true collaborative conversation to flourish. When your guest shares something meaningful, you reflect it back. "That sounds heavy. That sounds like it changed you." You carried that alone. You're not interpreting. You're not fixing. You're not answering. You're simply showing them that you heard them. Reflection creates psychological safety. And psychological safety permits stories that are not only powerful to hear, but meaningful for the person sharing them. And here is the most incredible thing about the HEAR framework. With it, you have allowed stories to unfold that are as valuable to the teller as they are to the listener. Let me show you how listening to HEAR works when I'm in clinic. A patient sits across from me with his arms folded, no eye contact. Every answer was short, sharp. It was obvious he didn't want to be there. I asked a routine question about why he'd come in, and he shrugged and said, "My spouse thinks I need to get checked, but honestly, no one in medicine really knows what they're doing anyway." Hold the space. Instead of correcting him, instead of defending medicine, I paused just long enough to let the moment breathe, to allow for signal recognition. Examine. The words sounded cynical, but his body told a different story. His shoulders were tense, his jaw was tight, arms were crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. It wasn't defiance, it was fear. Ask. So I asked gently, "What's made it feel that way for you?" He shifted uncomfortably in his seat and he told me his neighbor had died of cancer the month before. Same age, same lifestyle, no warning. And now his spouse had insisted he come in for a checkup. So the resistance wasn't skepticism, it was protection. Reflect. I said, "You must really miss your neighbor." His arms uncrossed slowly. He exhaled, and for the first time, he looked at me. Not because I had answers, but because he felt understood. He told me about how his neighbor was his way to unwind at the end of the day. Chipping golf balls in the backyard, Saturday cookouts with baseball on the radio, leaning over the fence, sharing a beer, solving nothing, just being there together. Then he told me what scared him most, that his neighbor had seemed fine, strong, active, normal, until he wasn't. The problem, he said, is that health issues hide, and he was afraid that if he came in, if I looked too closely, I might find something he couldn't unsee. And once that was on the table, the visit stopped being about resistance and started being about trust. That moment became the turning point for a healthy relationship with medicine, not because of a brilliant line of questioning, but because of how I listened. If this can happen in one brief interaction, imagine what's possible in a 45-minute interview when someone truly feels heard. Great podcasting isn't about performance. It's about presence. When you learn to hear what your guest meant to say, your conversations become deeper, truer, and unforgettable for you, your guest, and everyone listening.